Every individual and every family has their story. And this story contributes or fits into the larger story of a people or a nation, which in turn fits into the larger story of humankind. And it's important that we tell these stories because these stories are reminders of who we are and where we came from. We hopefully don't repeat past mistakes, since, as the saying goes, those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. We look at the past not only to find our identity, but also to figure out where it is that we don't want to go back to. America certainly has a lot of stories to be told and retold, from the Pilgrim's journey on the Mayflower to escape religious persecution, to our Declaration of Independence from a tyrannical British monarch, from George Washington crossing the Delaware to the settling of the West and the expedition of Lewis and Clark. We remember the brave souls who fell at the Alamo, the war between the states, the settling of the West, 2 world wars and a Great Depression, the struggles against communism, various political scandals, Reaganomics, hanging chads, 9/11, and most recently, a COVID pandemic. And making up all those larger stories are the stories of individuals, the stories of families who affected those events, whose lives affected those events, and whose lives were affected by them. And these stories, again, they shaped us, they made us who we are, and these stories need to keep on being told so that we can remember who we are, where we came from, and where we don't want to go again. And as with America, Israel has a lot of stories as well. And much of that history is surveyed in Psalm 78. The psalmist begins by urging his readers to hear the stories he tells. He says in verse 2, "I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter hidden things from of old." We often associate the word parables with the stories that Jesus told, stories that were very short stories taken from common everyday life, but usually with a very surprise and unexpected twist in order to illustrate life under the reign of God. Our author commits to keeping stories going on. In the parable that he uses here, the term he's using the term more generally as a general story, a story in general. Our author is committed to tell the stories of old, the stories that are hidden from those who are either prone to forget or those who have not yet heard. Our author commits to being the one who will keep those stories alive, or at least one who will keep those stories alive. The stories of a people give future generations encouragement, hope, and some pretty stout warnings. It's important that these stories be kept and that they be told, and that they keep being told and not be lost in the move from one generation to another. The stories in verse 2 are equivalent to hidden things. Some translations has the phrase dark things, but the New American Standard got it right when it translated the term riddles. A riddle is a puzzle to be solved, like a mystery. And the psalm will speak in mysteries. But how is it the psalmist is speaking in mysteries or riddles when everything he says is pretty straightforward? Well, the mystery is, it seems that the mystery is that Israel seemed unable to trust God despite all that he had done for them. Israel is reminded of God's mighty acts in verses 11 through 16. He had done miracles in Egypt, led them through the Red Sea with a wall of water on either side of them, led them through the desert with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night, and he gave them water from rocks in the desert. But after all that, Israel continued to distrust God and to murmur against him. In verses 17 and 18, but they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the wilderness against the Most High. They willfully put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. As the psalm continues, there is further note of Israel speaking against God. When hungry, they refused to believe that he could provide. So they asked in verse 19, can God spread a table in the desert? They reason in verse 20 that sure, he gave us water from a rock, but can he also provide food? Well, here is the mystery. If God gave water from a rock, can they not trust him to give them food as well? Is it any wonder that in verses 21 and 22, when the Lord heard them, he was furious His fire broke out against Jacob, and his wrath rose against Israel, for they did not believe in God or trust in his deliverance. Now, isn't that a sad statement? They did not believe in God or trust in his deliverance. Now, that does not mean that they doubted God's existence. I mean, they all knew that God existed. He had made his presence known. But as author Marvin Tate writes, belief and its synonym faith is not mere intellectual assent to certain ideas about God, but it's an attitude toward him that takes seriously his promises and his commands. Israel in the desert had not taken God's promises seriously. He had promised Abraham's descendants a land. He had promised those descendants success, and they believed it as long as the miracles kept happening. But when things got rough, even for a little while, they were ready to throw in the towel. They were ready to give up. It was such a fair weather loyalty, but not the kind of unwavering and committed faith that God desires. While Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is the conviction of things not seen, we may find ourselves wavering when we don't see a way out of our messes. We forget the stories of old. We forget about God's excellent track record. We must return to the stories of Scripture. We must tell them over and over, for we are called to pass them on to future generations. And so in Bible classes with children, when the stories are told of the days of creation and Noah's Ark and baby Moses in the basket and the stubbornness of Pharaoh and the Red Sea crossing and the lives of people like Samuel and Ruth and the teachings of Jesus and Paul, no one is wasting their time by telling or repeating those stories. Those stories are foundational for building a life. The psalmist agrees to keep them alive and keep them in the hearts and the minds of his listeners. But how could Israel not have trusted God for deliverance? He had delivered them from famine in Canaan. He had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, from the armies of Pharaoh, from passage through the Red Sea. He had led them and gave them water in the desert. They've been delivered, meaning rescued from famine, slavery, death, and thirst. And the psalmist repeats these stories so that future generations will not forget. These stories, according to verse 3, are what we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us. And as I've said, they are to be passed down. In verses 4 through 6, we will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children. So the next generation would know them, even the children not yet born, and they in turn would tell their children. But what is the impact these stories are to have? Why are we passing them down through generations? The answers are in verses 7 and 8, so the future generations will not forget God's deeds, and so they'll keep his commandments. And what these next generations need to hear are not only the commandments of God, not just an arbitrary list of rules, but they need to hear these commandments in the context of the stories in which they were given. They need to know the whole story of how Israel was rescued from Egypt and led through the desert to Sinai, where they received the law of Moses. And we likewise need to hear the story of how Jesus delivers us from sin. The New Testament instruction grows out of that story of how Jesus delivered us from sin by leaving the comforts of heaven, taking on human flesh, living a perfect life, healing and teaching, and then finally dying on a cross for our sins, and then being raised from the dead, seated at the right hand of God, from where he pours out his Spirit on the day of Pentecost, launching an endeavor to bring this gospel, this good news, to the whole world. These stories are important so that, according to verse 8, the future generations will not be like their forefathers, whose hearts were not loyal to God and whose spirits were not faithful to him. We don't want to be like those grumblers in the desert who whined and moaned as if God had never done anything for them. We don't like to be those. We don't want to be those, though they had been redeemed from slavery. They had been led through the Red Sea, given water miraculously. Still, they could doubt that God would feed them. No wonder he's angry in verse 21. But despite Israel's sin, verse 23 begins with the word yet. Yet, in spite of Israel's lack of faith, God will come through for them again. He gave a command to the heavens, and it rained down manna, the bread of angels for the people to eat. Though the people have been faithless, God remained faithful. In verses 26 and 27, references to the quail that God sent into the camp along with the manna. But along with the quail, first of all, notice that he treats his people better than they deserve, but he does not turn a blind eye to unrepentant sin. His anger rose against them, and along with the quail, God sent a plague into the camp, which took many of them out. Verse 31 alludes to that event in Numbers 11:33. The people have experienced God's blessing as well as his discipline. They've seen his grace and they've seen his wrath. This makes Psalm 78:32 all the more astonishing. In spite of all this, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. How can that be? And how can it be that America today is in the same boat? The most blessed nation ever in the history of the world. We've been so blessed with so many victories, and we've had some tragedies too, but we get through them. We should be able to see God's hand in our history. But in spite of all that, people keep on sinning, and sin continues to be endorsed. And in spite of God's wonders, people do not believe. It is so sad. And as with those other nations who continually rejected God, might there come a day that our nation faces his wrath as well? Israel did. As an entire generation wandered in the wilderness and died there, they would never see the land of promise to which God was leading the nation. Verse 33 says, God ended their days in futility and their years in terror. But in the intervening years, and later in the land of promise, the people would go back and forth. Whenever God slew them, they would seek him, according to verse 44. In other words, when things went bad, as in the days of the judges, when Israel's enemies would abuse and oppress them, Israel would cry out to God, and he would send a judge to deliver them. But it wasn't long before the cycle of faithless disobedience would resurface. Verse 35 describes how it was when times were desperate. They remembered that God was their rock, that the Most High God was their Redeemer. That's how it was when things got bad. But after a while, when things started going well again, people would start taking credit for their own successes. They stopped looking to God, but trusted in themselves and their idols. They had the appearance of religion, but they weren't sincere. Verses 36 and 37, but then they would flatter him with their mouths, lying to him with their tongues. Their hearts were not loyal to him. They were not faithful to his covenant. The pattern repeats itself often throughout the Old Testament, and yet God does not wipe the nation out. In verses 38 and 39, he was merciful. He forgave their iniquities and did not destroy them. Time after time, he restrained his anger and did not stir up his full wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breeze that does not return. God is so good and so gracious. He gives every opportunity for us to repent. He restrains his anger time and again. He isn't looking for a reason to trap you or condemn you, but if anyone is condemned, it is because of their own stubborn refusal to walk with God. But he gives every opportunity. He treats us better than we deserve. He remembers that we are flesh. Just as at times we may withhold the severest of punishments from our children, we know that they are but children. Not that we threaten without following through. We don't do that, but we reserve the severest of disciplines for repeat offenses. But we realize at the same time that they are children, and we remember that we were children, and we're aware of the enticement of curiosity and experimentation. While there's no excuse for disobedience, we've been prone at times to give them every chance. God remembers that we are just passing through like a breeze. Our lives are relatively short and in many respects difficult. We are finite beings with finite brains. We are weak, and we are flesh. We are not gods. But the one God who is sympathetic to our human plight, and even more so since having come in the flesh and died on a cross, The sending of God's Son was his ultimate act of mercy, and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead was God's ultimate mighty act. Far from being rebellious, we have all the more reason to outdo our spiritual forebears in terms of our level of obedience. The psalm follows a pattern from verses 11 through 39, which then repeats itself in verses 40 through 72. The pattern is as follows. First, we have the mighty acts of God to redeem his people, coupled with their short memories as they test God's patience with their unbelief. That's verses 11 through 20. Then we have divine wrath coupled with divine grace, as God both punishes and forgives in verses 21 through 31. Third, we have further rebellion in verses 32 through 37. But this first section ends on a positive note in verses 38 and 39, where God is merciful and does not destroy his people. Now in verse 40, this whole pattern begins to repeat itself again. First, we have the mighty acts of God to redeem his people, coupled with their short memories as they test God's patience with their unbelief. In verse 40, how often they rebelled against him in the desert. In verse 41, again and again, they put God to the test. They vexed the Holy One of Israel. How many times have you felt that your kids have done that to you? They just kept pushing you. They just kept tempting you. And so you have just a small inkling of what it must be that we put God through. In verse 42, the people did not remember God's power, so the author reminds them of the wonders in Egypt, including the plagues, some of which are listed here, such as the blood turned into water, the swarms of flies, frogs, and grasshoppers. Hail destroys crops and cattle. And then finally, there is the death of Egypt's firstborn. This is verses 40 through 51. Then in verses 52 through 55, we see both divine wrath and divine grace. But this time the wrath is directed toward the Egyptian army as they attempt to pursue Israel through the Red Sea. Verse 53 says that the sea engulfed Israel's enemies. Upon Israel's arrival at Canaan in verses 54 and 55, the Canaanites are driven from the hill country as the Israelites settle in their houses. But in contrast to God's severe treatment of Egypt and the Canaanites, his gentleness with Israel is evident. In verse 52, he brought the people out of Egypt like a flock, leading them like sheep through the desert. He guides them to safety in verse 53. The next section recalls further rebellion on the part of Israel in verses 56 through 64 as they continue to put God to the test. In verse 57, like their ancestors, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. Now that is a colorful illustration. As unreliable as a faulty bow. You take aim at the buck who has walked under your deer stand, and the bow somehow malfunctions. The arrow haplessly falls to the ground as opposed to taking the path you projected. That's how unreliable people's God have become. The section describes their behavior in the final days of the judges. Samuel is the nation's prophet. Eli and his sons are in charge of the tabernacle. The nation has angered God with their idolatry in their high places. The section, the priests are corrupt, and so God allows the people's defeat at the hands of the Philistines. Verse 59 says that God rejects Israel completely. Verses 60 through 64 says, He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among men. He sent the ark of his might into captivity, his splendor into the hands of the enemy. He gave his people over to the sword. He was furious with his inheritance. Fire consumed their young men, and their young women had no wedding songs. Their priests were put to the sword, and their widows could not weep. The sons of Eli die in battle. The Ark of the Covenant is taken by the Philistines, and upon hearing this news, Eli, the old priest, falls backward in his chair, and his neck breaks. In a matter of time, after they get the ark back, the tabernacle will relocate to Nob. Many young men die in battle, leaving behind widows and broken-hearted fiancés. It was thought that during this time God had truly stopped dwelling with Israel. Everything seemed to be as bad as it could get. A new king, Saul, was appointed, but he was a royal disappointment. But the final section of this psalm ends on a positive note, as the first section had done in verse 38. In verse 38, we have a reference to God's mercy, and now it seems, according to verse 65, that the Lord awoke from sleep. Now, that doesn't mean that the Lord was literally not conscious, but it seems that after a period of non intervention, God is involved with Israel yet again. He appoints a new king. God's choosing of the tribe of Judah over Ephraim in verses 67 and 68 is likely a reference to which tribe this king belongs. While some famous men like Joshua were from the Ephraimites, this king will come from the unlikely tribe of Judah. Since Ephraim was sometimes used of all the northern tribes due to its being so large, this could refer to the rejection of northern Israel, who at first rejected David as their king as they attempted to give Saul a dynasty. During his first 7 years as king, you might recall that David only reigned over Judah. The building of God's sanctuary in the heights in verse 69 could refer to David's plan for a temple on Mount Zion, which God had chosen in verse 68. And the psalm concludes with David in verses 70 and 71, chosen as God's servant from the sheep pens to become shepherd of God's people. And verse 72 says, David shepherded them with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands he led them. So by this time, things were looking up for Israel. They had good and godly leadership to lead them in the right way. The psalm was written by Asaph, according to the heading that appears just prior to verse 1. Asaph was a contemporary of David and one of the chief musicians in the tabernacle. So it stands to reason that Asaph would write this psalm in celebration of a newly appointed king. And the psalm ends here because this is as far as they've got in Israel's history so far. The old stories are recollected so that Israel might not fall back on their old ways as they launch into this new beginning. The psalm could have been used in different ways throughout the years. It could have been applied as a warning just prior to Judah going into Babylonian captivity. It could have been used to encourage the returning exiles from Babylon under Ezra and Nehemiah. It could have been used to comfort the Jews who were under Roman oppression in the first century. This psalm is both a call to obedience and a call to hope, neither of which is mutually exclusive. The psalm celebrates the kingdom of David, but later anticipates a coming Messiah who will ascend to his throne. It's the second longest psalm because these stories need to be told. The victories need to encourage and the defeats serve as warnings, and these all contribute to the larger story, the greatest story of all, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ. For there to be any hope for anyone at all, this story must continue to be told. Are you ready to accept Jesus as your Lord and King?